Now let's talk about Stonehenge, the Beaker people, and the so-called Bronze Age. This lecture tracks the first two stages of the development and adaptation of the world's most sophisticated and best-known megalithic monument, Stonehenge, from the first indication of the site's importance in the 4th millennium BCE to the 22nd century thereof. After a survey of the range of speculations about the purpose and original significance of Stonehenge, this lecture presents the several diverse elements of this unique assemblage, discussing current theories of construction methods and dating. Then comes a discussion of the arrival of a new people, the Beaker people, who imported quite a different culture, involving beer and round barrows and horsemanship and bronze casting, as well as their distinctive personal beakers, which have given their culture its name. To them belongs credit for the construction of Stonehenge II, a product of the 22nd century BCE. Stonehenge is perhaps the world's best-known megalithic monument, and for good reason. Begun about the time that Silbury Hill was being constructed up at Avebury, it was redesigned and reworked for over 2 millennia, and finally completed from the point of view of its last builders 9 centuries or so after work had stopped at Avebury, by which time Avebury seems to have been effectively abandoned or at least ignored. But Stonehenge seems to have been a place of worship and perhaps of cosmic scientific speculation for well over yet another millennium, thanks to the Iron Age priesthood of the Druids, until the Roman conquerors of Britain put an end to that religious order. No European Neolithic or Bronze Age monument has approached the fame of Stonehenge. It was referred to by a Greek geographer of the 3rd century BCE as the temple built to the god Apollo by the Hyperboreans, the people who lived beyond the north wind, behind the north wind. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing his History of the Kings of Britain in Oxford between 1136 and 1138, asserted that Merlin had erected Stonehenge as a monument to King Arthur's fallen heroes. It's a monument to the heroic British war dead fighting against the Saxons. And he had arranged to steal its standing stones from Ireland, by magic, not by force, from Ireland, where those stones were called the Dance of the Giants. So the Dance of the Giants took to the air and flew over to Britain thanks to Merlin's remarkable magical arrangements. William Stukely, born in 1687, dying in 1765, the eccentric but widely read English doctor, medical doctor, and antiquarian, who developed a wild theory of the Druidic religion, even though he was an ordained Anglican clergyman, rhapsodized about the meaning of Stonehenge. For him it was the supreme Druidic temple. And he made it famous after centuries of local attention, sporadic local attention, which was, however, fundamentally neglectful. Stonehenge was auctioned off in 1915 as a piece of private real estate, as it had been for quite a while, but then the new purchaser gave it to the government, and the Department of the Environment is slowly improving the site. In 1781, shortly after Stukely's death, Henry Hurrell founded the Ancient Order of Druids, which is still in existence today. Equipped with a Hindu-inspired ritual, since of course the Druids learned everything by memory and didn't want to commit any of their lore to writing. This order has attracted even such practical people as Winston Churchill, who was a member. Stonehenge is of course the prime temple of the Ancient Order of Druids. William Blake, born in 1757, dying 70 years later in 1827, developed Stukely's vision further in his rambling prophetic work, Jerusalem. I don't know what to call it except prophetic. It's poetry, it's prose, it's an extraordinary work, and let's just call it a prophetic work and leave it at that. Published in 1818, he declared that Stonehenge became for Britain, or for Albion as he preferred to call it, the successor to the Temple of Solomon, as the Druidic religion, which was a religion of law and science, replaced the poetic inspiration of the primitive Hebrew faith. Now, that primitive Hebrew faith, according to Blake, had actually arisen in Britain, not in the Near East. And if we're somewhat amused at those early 19th century Protestant ministers who decided that Serpent Mound is the site of the Garden of Eden, that the events of sacred history had transpired in North America, we should recognize at least that this line of thought, known as British Israelitism, or the theory of British Israel, has a long and distinguished history in Britain, promoted by no less a figure than William Blake. Thomas Hardy, who was born before Blake died in 1840, or after Blake died. Hardy was born in 1840 and died at the age of 88 in the year before the Great Depression in 1928. Hardy gave Stonehenge a yet wider audience when he made it the site of Tess's final surrender to the capricious immortals in his most widely read novel, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which was published in 1891. Now, in the 20th century, a much more serious kind of speculation about Stonehenge got underway. Most importantly, an astronomical purpose was assigned to it. In 1956, an important date for the study of Stonehenge, Gerald Hawkins, a British professor of astronomy at Boston University in America, published Stonehenge Decoded, a book published and republished in many revised versions, in which Hawkins claimed that Stonehenge was constructed as an observatory to observe, record, and predict many diverse movements of the sun, moon, and even some navigational stars. Hawkins' claim was strongly resisted by professional archaeologists such as the great R.J.C. Atkinson, who long directed the excavations at the site. However, in the last revised version of his basic book for a popular audience, simply entitled Stonehenge, and published by Penguin, Atkinson came around to a very modified version of Hawkins' thesis. Aubrey Burrell, the brilliant, imaginative interpreter of Avebury, went to work on Stonehenge too, after he had published his work, Prehistoric Avebury. In 1987, he published a book called The Stonehenge People, and in it, he accepts the notion that Stonehenge had from the beginning some astronomical significance, but he insists that its primary function had to do with death and burial. It is for him a grim monument rather than an enlightened temple to Neolithic science or Bronze Age science. In the early 20th century, Sir Arthur Evans, the great Oxford archaeologist who dug up the Palace of Knossos at Crete, made such an impact upon Mediterranean archaeology, had decided that Stonehenge was absolutely that it was a funereal monument which was supposed to suggest strong connections to the netherworld. Burrell follows out Evans' theory, developing the sort of a remark of Evans. Burrell makes an entire and really deeply reasoned book out of it. According to Burrell, Hardy got it right when he had Tess surrender there to unmasterable forces, which were really forces of evil, or at least forces of depression. Well, Stonehenge's construction has been described in terms of three, or really actually of 5 different phases, which are conventionally described as Stonehenge 1, 2, 3A, 3B, and 3C. Now, some people disagree about what actually happened in 1 as opposed to 2, but fundamentally, all people have held to these basic labels. Stonehenge 1 is the first stage of this unique monument, built by the Windmill Hill culture in the territory to the south of the Windmill Hill territory where the vast ritual complex of Avebury had arisen. This is the territory that Paul Ashby calls the Robin Hood's Ball territory, but the one which had 111 long barrows constituting that important people. Stonehenge 1 consists of 8 elements of interestingly different character. Nothing as grand and extraordinary as the diversity of Avebury, but even in many ways far more interesting on a much smaller and more refined scale. The henge proper, the circular ditch and bank here, the bank is inside the ditch, unlike Avebury. The ditch and bank are exceptionally shallow, nor is the circle particularly large. Its diameter from outer edge to outer edge of the ditch is less than 350 feet. Stonehenge 1 was clearly not designed to impress. By the time it was laid out, Neolithic Britons knew what a henge meant, if only we did. Element number 2 is the heel stone. It got its name from John Aubrey in 1666. He thought the uneven surface of that sarsen stone resembled a large foot, of which the heel was clearly marked, and the name has stuck. This stone is located 65 feet beyond the outer ditch to the northeast, where the ditch and bank are broken, indicating a direction of orientation. The henge of Stonehenge is oriented to the northeast, and more specifically to the place where the sun rises at midsummer, in that latitude. In 1980, the archaeologist Michael Pitts identified a rectangular depression in the undisturbed chalk as the former site of the heel stone's twin, which would seem to have been about the same size. These were large sarsen stones, weighing between 40 and 60 tons, dragged down from the Marlborough Downs 18 miles to the north. Not just 18 miles away, twice. The draggers of these stones would have had to go down into river valleys. That would have been convenient, but then they would have had to drag the things up from the other side of the river valley, which would have been inconvenient indeed. How many rawhide ropes would they have needed to do that? Hard to estimate. A line drawn between the heel stone and its vanished twin, between the heel stone and the vanished twin from the center of the henge, which is called the axis of symmetry on most current plans of Stonehenge, and I'll call it that for simplicity's sake. That line points to the spot on the horizon where the sun rises at midsummer, which, as you know, is normally the 21st of June, though the date can vary as widely as all the way from the 19th of June to the 23rd. A low embankment surrounds the heel stone, but curiously enough, not its twin, unless the embankment was put up later after the twin had been torn down, had been taken down. The sites of two smaller stones have been found along the axis of symmetry, the line leading to the center of the henge, and they were placed at uneven distances, but roughly equal distances between the heel stone twin axis and the flat northeastern opening of the henge. At the place where the henge bank stops to leave a flat approach to the northeast, there was a fourth element of Stonehenge, and another large Sarsen stone which has long been lying flat and which now has been called the Slaughter Stone for several centuries. It has that lurid name because early modern visitors imagined human sacrifices and other demonic activities taking place there. It was almost certainly set upright and later it fell down or was pulled down, as likely happened to the heel stone's twin. It's located just to the right of the axis of symmetry. It also seems to have had a twin, broken up and carried away. All this has led some to speculate that the original planners of Stonehenge 1 envisioned 4 upright Sarsen stones marking the summer sunrise axis. Element number 5, post holes. Several post holes, 3 dozen or more, have been found in the chalk at the northeast entry to the henge, and another 6 just behind the heel stone. This has led archaeologists to conclude that the planners of Stonehenge 1 set up wooden posts there for moon sightings, that is, the rising and the setting of the moon at different times of the year. This is very complicated. I won't try to get into it. But John Aubrey, for example, asserts very clearly that Stonehenge 1 was much more concerned with the moon than with the sun. With Stonehenge 2 came the orientation to solar activity. Element number 6. 56 holes, now called Aubrey holes, in honor of John Aubrey, the 17th century antiquarian who gave the heel stone its name, and to whom we owe the first reliable description of Stonehenge and of Avebury. These 56 holes were dug at regular intervals just inside the low embankment of the henge. Wooden posts were originally placed in them, and pottery and bones were deposited later in some of them. They may relate, these Aubrey holes, to the 55-plus year cycle of the moon's setting and rising positions from that vantage point. Hawkins went so far as to argue that the function of the Aubrey holes and their posts was to predict lunar eclipses. Very few people have followed him in that speculation. Element number 7. 4 station stones were set up in a rectangular quadrilateral just within the embankment, either toward the end of the Stonehenge 1 project or perhaps even later in Stonehenge 2 or 3. 3 of these stones are visible today. 2 of them, at the southeast and northwest corners of their rectangle, are surrounded by low embankments which overlap the henge's main bank, and this has led several archaeologists to conclude that they were rebuilt as late as Stonehenge 3, 3A or 3B, something. The 4 sides of that rectangle mark out the zones within which midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset must occur at that latitude, and within which the moon must rise and set. One of the most striking features of this rectangle is that it only works at that latitude. 10 or a dozen miles further north or south, any such rectangle, any such quadrilateral could not be rectangular. Its angles would not be 90-degree angles. Now, this raises the question. Did Neolithic astronomers notice that after Stonehenge 1 was built and then set up the station stones? Or did some of them know this even before and thus choose this as the place at which to set up this extraordinary temple to the moon and sun, if that indeed is what they thought they were doing? The 8th, and in some ways the strangest element of Stonehenge 1, is a curious feature which Stukely called the cursus. It's about a third of a mile away to the north. And Stukely called it the cursus because he was sure it must have been the site of a racetrack. Foot races probably, although he was thinking of druids with horses, as a matter of fact. But we know that it was set up before horses were at all common in Britain. Domesticated horses may not have existed at all at that time. The courses consist of parallel embankments closed at either end, like a very long attenuated sausage, if you want. It runs almost exactly east-west, actually just slightly south of west to north of east, for nearly 2 miles. At its eastern end is a long barrow oriented due south. Neolithic Britons erected a few other courses, the purpose of which still remain entirely mysterious. There's a much smaller one, a little unfinished one, about 1/4 of a mile to the northwest of the Great Stonehenge courses. 3/4 of a mile to the east of the Great Courses, in line with its axis, is a small henge now called Woodhenge, overlooking the river Avon. Its low bank enclosed an oval wooden house constructed of large and small posts, almost certainly roofed with wheat thatch, and almost certainly a mortuary house, a charnel house for excarnation. Just to the north of Woodhenge, immediately to the north of it, was a large henge several times the size of Stonehenge, now called Durrington Walls, also with its roundhouse of logs and thatch, almost certainly, once again, a mortuary house situated pretty close to the center of that henge. So some think, Burl certainly likes the idea, that these things began as funerary monuments, these henges did, and then got turned into a kind of astronomical direction. Or he admits there may have been an initial astronomical interest, which then involved the construction of a mortuary house. Burl is convinced that there was such a mortuary house, but interestingly enough, a rectangular one, not a circular one, inside Stonehenge 1. So, Stonehenge was situated in a cluster of pre-existing Neolithic monuments. Perhaps the courses is even earlier than the henge. Burl is inclined to date it as early as 3500, so it really predates Stonehenge 1, which he thinks was laid out fundamentally starting around 2750 BCE, about the time that Silbury Hill was being constructed at Avebury, 18 or 20 miles to the northwest. R.J.C. Atkinson originally estimated the dates of Stonehenge 1 as 2350 to 1900 BCE, but revised that estimate backward to about 2800 BCE. Now, this is a sign of a general movement. Carbon-14 dating has moved back most Neolithic monuments dates. In fact, under the present car park at Stonehenge have been found 3 post holes dug for very large tree trunks. It would be difficult to put the arms of a middle-sized man around them. And these tree trunks have been dated by calibrated carbon-14 calculations as far back as the 4th millennium BCE, perhaps even predating the courses. So this has been thought some kind of very special site for a very long time. You can't tell from 3 post holes exactly if they're oriented at anything or what they could possibly have been for. One thinks of totem poles of the Northwest Native Americans. Some centuries after Stonehenge 1 was complete, a new people arrived in Britain. We call them the Beaker people because of the distinctive pots with which they like to be buried. The signs of this new people's culture are unmistakable. The round barrows in which many of their skeleta have been found always contain 1 ceramic beaker per person. If a man and woman are buried together, 2 beakers, usually one larger for the man and one smaller for the woman, are usually found next to their bones. Now, of course, a lot of these beakers were opened up by amateur ladies and gentlemen in the 18th and 19th century, and the beakers were, and other objects like flints and so on were removed to somebody's country house, and most of the bones were simply thrown away or reburied or something of that sort. So we can't be as certain as we would like to be. There are fortunately a fair number of beakers which have been explored scientifically, and some of these antiquarians kept pretty good records, and there are a few which have not been opened yet, which archaeologists are saving for the future with what I think is great generosity. In the properly identified beakers, if a baby's skeleton is present, then he or she usually has a baby beaker along as well. These beakers are easily classified in a sequence of closely related styles, clearly related to the bell beakers of megalithic Spain and megalithic Central Europe. And the beaker people were often buried with bronze jewelry and/or weapons. They seem to have been bronze smiths, bringing to the British Isles a metal technology which had been developed in the Near East, in Mesopotamia, in the 4th millennium. And so they come in nearly 2,000 years later, really about 1,500 years later with this new technology. The beaker people seem to have brought along also the brewing of beer, made mostly from barley, which they appear to have imbibed from their beakers. Were these beakers therefore a sign of individual character? Everybody has to have a beaker, an individual character which could be heightened to an alcoholic euphoria from time to time, a habit unfortunately long deeply ingrained in Western culture and in some other cultures as well. The Beaker people also brought horses, which they either rode or had pulling their wagons, or both. Their wagons may well have carried the bronze makers' equipment and materials. They found very good bronze-making materials in Britain, of course. The tin of Cornwall was tremendously convenient. It was, in fact, exported all the way to the eastern Mediterranean. The Beaker people may have come to Britain to get closer to the tin supply, some speculate, rather than to find new lands to conquer. These people were physically quite distinct from the native Neolithic British. They were somewhat taller, they were brachycephalic or round-headed, and they tended to mate with their own physical type. They were, to use that simple categorization of European races as Mediterranean, Nordic, and Alpine, they were Alpines. Now one has to ask, whence, when, and how did the Beaker people arrive in Britain? One of the earliest known Beakers, found at the eastern end of the West Kennet Long Barrow at Avebury, perhaps with the last burial there, seems to date, again by carbon-14 dating, from about 2250 BCE. So the 23rd century seems a good guess at the general date of this new people's arrival. They clearly came from the continent, but whether ultimately from Spain or from Central Europe is, as you can imagine, hotly debated. Did the Beaker people come as conquerors? Gordon Childe, and practically everyone else who speculated about such things until the late 20th century, assumed that European prehistory was marked by the same pattern as European history. Waves of invaders coming from the east, and those who won would have having a superior culture, at least in regards to warfare. You can't say that the Germans had a culture superior to the Romans, but their culture was better at warfare, at least in taking over the western provinces, than Roman culture was at that point. And so the assumption was that this had been a long, long pattern which began in prehistory, which the pattern was laid in prehistory, in the Neolithic, and simply continued all the way up through the invasion of the Normans. If that's the case, then it's very likely, it's very reasonable to assume that the Beaker people came in and took over the Windmill Hill culture and erected a kind of chieftainship, a Beaker chieftainship, which would, of course, want to leave its mark. Mid and late 20th century archaeologists, however, have come to suspect that the Beaker people came as bronzesmiths and traders rather than as conquering warriors. And they kept to themselves as they lived among the not particularly welcoming people of the Windmill Hill culture. Hence their separate burials and the race of distinctiveness we find within them, products not of some sense of racist superiority, but of a feeling of rejection, perhaps. They were rich enough so they could make magnificent burials, but perhaps they did not entirely fit in with that society, which eventually, according to Burrell's theory, expelled them. Aubrey Burrell thinks that after a few generations, the native British either expelled the Beaker people or absorbed their culture without succumbing to their rule. So he posits a fused culture in the region after 2150. Along with other archaeologists, he calls this the Wessex culture, which he and others date from 2150 to 1400 or 1300, depending on which part of southern England one is talking about. If Burrow is correct, Stonehenge, too, is the reactivated monument of the Beaker people before the new fused culture, the Wessex culture, got going. The most striking new development at Stonehenge in the period called Stonehenge II were two concentric circles of blue stones set up around the center of the henge. Now these blue stones, much smaller than the sarsen menhirs of Stonehenge I and III, came from the Preseli Mountains in southwest Wales. An alternative explanation, they're being deposited there by glacial withdrawal before, has been pretty much rejected. And there seems to be a fairly widespread consensus that the Preseli Mountains in the southwest of Wales are the source of these stones. But this immediately raises a whole raft of questions. Those mountains are roughly 150 miles away from Stonehenge as the crow flies. And if you estimate the possible routes of water transport, those involve distances of 200, even in according to one estimate, 250 miles. What can have been so special about the stone from those mountains to justify the complexity, the difficulty, the challenge of that transport? In any event, these blue stones make a dramatic statement once you know their source. They must have made such a statement then, and if we know their source now, the statement is still very striking. The other most striking feature of Stonehenge II is the avenue, a curving approach defined by two parallel embankments that curl from the northeast entry of the henge to the Avon River, which is about 2 miles away right there. The avenue begins, or ends depending on on how you're walking it. It begins heading northeast, prolonging the midsummer sunrise axis, and then heads east, due east, and eventually curves rather abruptly down toward the banks of the Avon. It's generally assumed these days that the avenue was set up to mark the arrival of the blue stones, borne to that point by water transport, or perhaps processions, remembering the transport of these blue stones, which carried whatever kind of sacral or ritual significance. Brill thinks that the northeastern stretch of the avenue was part of Stonehenge 1, and that in Stonehenge 2, the Beaker people curved it eastward and then south to meet the banks of the Avon to make a point about what they had made possible. Whether they made this possible because they were rulers and ordered other people to transport these stones, or because they were very rich and simply funded this event, possibly hoping for approval by the community, we cannot tell. But either of those, I think, is a very interesting kind of alternative explanation. Brill dates Stonehenge 2, with its dramatic additions to and enhancements of Stonehenge 1, to 2200 BCE, and thus to the period of Beaker predominance, whether that predominance was cultural or also military and political. Atkinson, in his last estimate, preferred to say about 2100, and credited the Beaker people with this change. Some, like Julian Richards, who's written the basic book on Stonehenge for English Heritage, the book that the tourists pick up en masse, think that the first set of sarsen stones, the heel stone and slaughter stone and their twins, were part of this dramatic recasting of Stonehenge, and inspired and perhaps directed by the Beaker people. Stonehenge 1, in other words, would have had simply the henge, the avenue, the Aubrey holes, and so on. But I'd rather not complicate the story any further by dwelling on this alternative interpretation. In any event, this was not the last time the Stonehenge would undergo significant physical adaptation and reinterpretation at the hands of a new culture. It is entirely possible that Stukely's conviction that this was a center of Druid cult may be perfectly valid. We know from now fairly deep studies of Celtic religion that the Celts liked very much to make use of earlier shrines, that they thought that earlier holy places were possibly even more holy than any newer addition. And wherever we are able to track the behavior of the Druids, though that's very hard to do, so the Druids insisted on committing all of their lore to memory, thus keeping their monopoly of their wisdom. Whenever we can track Druid behavior, we find Druids doing precisely that kind of thing, redeveloping an old site. It is very likely that they, for example, built a grove of trees, or planted a grove of trees around many of these long barrows on the uplands of the Downs, because the Celts thought that groves had a certain religious significance, a high religious charge to them. And it's very reasonable that the Druids, especially if they got involved in astronomy, Julius Caesar tells us that they were fascinated by astronomy, carried on whatever the earlier builders of Stonehenge had figured out about movements of sun and moon, transmitting all of this lore, unfortunately, orally, by memory, rather than by committing it to writing, although writing in either the Greek or the Roman alphabet was perfectly accessible to them. And why is Stonehenge as damaged as it is today? It's generally thought, I think with good reason, because it's plausible, although there's not much in the way of anything you could call direct evidence, that the Romans did this. And what the Romans did to Stonehenge was not destroy it, not obliterate it. They could certainly have done that. Instead, they slighted it. Slighting means taking a monument and damaging part of it, making a big point of leaving the rest of it visible. The German army had very much this notion during World War I, as the lines of the Western Front curled around the city of Reims, whose cathedral had been a tremendous symbol of French nationalism. And so when the German army was given command, when the German artillery was given command to bombard the cathedral, the purpose was not to obliterate it, but to destroy the roof, to destroy the windows, what was left of the windows, and to leave a great shattered shell of Reims Cathedral as a sign of just how impotent French nationalist pride really was. Well, the general thought, popular among British archaeologists who speculate about these things, is that Stonehenge was slighted by the Roman general Vespasian, who would later become emperor. He was commanding a legion, the Second Legion, known as the Augusta, the Legio Secunda Augusta, a very proud name indeed, in the south of Britain. The invasion of Britain had begun by the command of the Emperor Claudius in the year 38 of our era. In between 38 and 40, it's thought Vespasian, encountering some resistance, perhaps led by the Druids, organized by them, then decided to slight Stonehenge in this manner. Remember how weak the Druids really were.